Hi, Nikita.
Hey, Bob.
How are you doing?
I can't complain.
Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Non-Zero Podcast. I also publish a Non-Zero newsletter. You're Nikita Petrov. Familiar to regular, both, I guess, newsletter readers and our podcast listeners. You used to do a lot of work for Non-Zero. Now you're focusing on other things like putting out your newsletter, Psychopolitica. Also working for the Glenn Show, which we kind of helped launch. You and I, at least the kind of the current version of it.
Yeah, well, you hosted the show for, or not hosted, but your platform hosted the show for the
show
first
per
10
se,
years.
yeah, I kind of launched many years ago, but kind of the current version of it, you were instrumental in launching. Anyway, it's doing very well. You're doing well relative to how you were doing not so long ago, because not so long ago you were in Russia hoping you'd be able to get out. This was after Putin ordered the mobilization. I want to get into all this. In fact, I think I'll leave people on the edge of their seats as to whether you did get out. They won't know. They have to listen for 3 more minutes to find that out. First, I want to say we're doing a couple of things. You and I are going to have, in the coming months, every so often, one of these conversations. We're going to always talk somewhat about Russia, and that will be related to a kind of a larger purpose that is central to the newsletter and my current mission and the current Non-Zero mission and so on, which is this cognitive empathy business. I have this claim that the world would be a much better place if everyone were better at understanding how the world looks from the point of view of other people, not necessarily sympathizing with them or caring about them even, but just understanding how they view the world. And in fact, I'm writing a book about that, and you know, the newsletter is often about that. And Russia is just a good test case right now, because I think, first of all, I think it's very important for Americans to try to understand how things are viewed in Russia from Putin's point of view, but from the point of view of various other actors in Russia. So I'm going to try to get you to help us illuminate that. But
yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be very helpful in that.
Oh, I know, but you're always humble about this. I'm going to get to that. Your epistemic humility with regard to this particular question, because that's an interesting part of the story. We should all be more epistemically humble when it comes to cognitive empathy. I should be, probably. But I think especially in a case like this, because I think, you know, most Americans think of certainly Putin, if not the Russian people, as an adversary, if not enemy. And when you have someone framed that way, that poses particular challenges to exercising cognitive empathy, I think. And for that matter, if it's somebody you love, a relative or a close friend, whatever, that poses other challenges. And you know, there's no such thing in a way as an easy case with cognitive empathy. So we're going to be doing this every so often, and kind of checking in on the progress of the project, the kind of newsletter project of exploring cognitive empathy, trying to help people get better at it if they want, and so on. And you and I are going to talk about things we can do to make the project better. But I always want to come back and make contact with this Russia question, because I think it is such a good way of thinking about it. Now, do you want to, I promised people we would give them an update on your plight. You are no longer in Russia. You're in Armenia. And I think maybe we did another conversation when you were in Armenia, but you've been back in Russia since then.
That's right. That's right. I left in March of this year, and I spent I think about 4 months it should be in Armenia, and then and it was always the plan I would go back to do some things. Uh, I wasn't able to get into the Russian consulate here in Armenia. They're not very open, seems like. And I needed to do that
You mean
too.
even in the minimal sense of having a door you can walk through?
There is a door. There's a very tired guard at the door who says you need to have appointment. And the appointment are only done online, and I think they're supposed to send you a confirmation email, and I never got the confirmation email. And there's an email that you can write to, and if you do, you get an automatic response saying this email does not exist. And there's a phone number which you can call, but it's always busy. So I just wasn't able to. It's like a Kafkaesque situation. There is a building,
Yeah.
but you can't get in.
It sounds like maybe helping Russians who have recently left Russia is not high on the Russian government's list of priorities right now.
Perhaps, yeah. Anyway, the reason I wanted to get there is because I wanted to get married, and so we weren't able to do this here. And so my then fiance and now wife came back to Russia to get married, and I needed to close my business registration. And this was a planned thing, but I ended up coming earlier because my grandmother died, and I needed to organize a funeral. And then there's, things needed to be done. So we were in Russia. Our plan was to leave later, maybe like a month later than I did. And then, yeah, I was at a cafe talking to a subscriber of my newsletter. I started doing this thing where I try to have conversations online, or in this case, this woman was in St. Petersburg. I met up with her. And in the middle of that conversation, my phone started to flare up, and it was my wife saying, Putin is saying, tomorrow they're going to recognize, they're going to start the referendums in LDR, DNR, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and they're going to last a week. And so we need to get you tickets right now.
Had he already announced the partial mobilization at this point?
No. At the time, our thought was, okay, so they're saying tomorrow they start the referendums. They're going to last a week. Obviously, they're going to say that everybody voted to be in Russia. And then at that point, the war is on the Russian territory, which means you should announce mobilization, maybe, or I don't know the legal terminology, war times, right? Officially, state of war. And our thought was that they are going to do it after the referendums are over. So we felt smart about getting the ticket right away, but we got the ticket for like the last day of the referendums. And then next morning, mobilization was announced, and then we felt dumb because we should have gotten a ticket for an earlier date. But I did get out, and most people got out. And even now, I think most people are able to leave. It's not clear what exactly is going on, because some people are just asked a couple of questions and go forward. Some people are asked a bunch of questions. I am starting to suspect there might be some kind of a mark on my profile, because both when I went back to Russia, I had to go through an extra check. They took my passport away, and I waited 40 minutes not knowing what exactly is going on. And then on my way out, they asked me a bunch of questions. Then they thought I had all the good answers. I had the return ticket. I bought the ticket. One of the questions is, when did you buy your ticket? And supposedly, if you bought it before mobilization was announced, that's a good thing. My case didn't put them at ease. And then the lady I was talking to pushed some kind of a button. A different lady appeared who was much more stern and asked more questions in a different way.
Now, was she with the FSB, the successor to the KGB?
That's right. The questions she was asking.
The second lady was, but the first was
the second. Right. The first one was just border control. The second, she said, you're gonna have to come with me, and on our way to a little booth that has the letters FSB on the door, she asked, more questions. You know, are you eligible for the draft? What is your category? Do you have a return ticket? This kind of thing. And then she asked, do you have, so she has, I think by that time she has my passport in her hands. In Russia, you have two passports, or rather, everybody has the domestic one. And then if you want, you can get a foreign passport that allows you to travel outside of the country. So I think she has my foreign passport in her hands, and she says, do you have any other documentation on you, such as the domestic passport or your military ID?
And by the way, were you eligible for the draft? What was the answer to that question?
That is also not totally clear. If you listen to Putin, no, because he said that only people with military training are going to be drafted. But we know that's not the case. There definitely are some cases where people in my category, which is no military training and like limited, fit for limited service or something like that, health-wise. There are definitely people in my category that have gotten their slip of paper, but then there's like,
well, how did you answer the question when she said, are you eligible for the draft?
I just said what my category is.
Okay.
The letter that signifies what I am. There's a guy who used to live next door to our family in my hometown who's been dead for 8 years. He got a slip of paper. His mother opened the door, and it's people from the military office wanting him to go serve and fight in the war. And she says he's been dead for 8 years. So it's not like the system.
They're going door to door, presumably because he didn't reply to initial thing or something. Or they?
No, that's how it legally. It only counts that you've been you've been served, kind of thing. Like you need to, you need to sign a piece of paper. Again, not always how it works in reality, from what I understand, but legally, unless you sign a piece of paper, then you haven't been drafted yet. Anyway, so on our way to this booth, she's asking me about the other documents. I say, I have all of those, and she says, give them to me. I hand her the documents, and she says, you're going to have to wait here. There was a weird moment where she got the documents. In hindsight, my understanding is the purpose of what she said is like, I want you to acknowledge, like, these are the documents that I have. I'm going to give them back to you. But at the time, it felt like she's being happy about how she tricked me. Like, she's saying, do you have the documents? I say, I do. She says, you're going to give them to me. And I give her the documents. And she goes, now look here. I got your passport. I got your foreign passport. I got your military ID. Sit here. And then she leaves.
And so that's kind of a way of saying, we're in the driver's seat. You better tell us the truth, you think?
Yeah, I guess so. So I sat there for like 10 minutes. And she came back and she had more questions, which were, have you visited your local military office? I said, no. She said, so you do not have any paper from them saying that you are allowed to leave? And I said, no, I do not. She said, your passport says you're registered in Moscow. You're flying out from St. Petersburg. What's up with that? And I said that my wife's grandmother got sick with COVID and we're visiting, which is kind of true. I mean, she did get sick with COVID, and we did visit her, though we also lived in St. Petersburg before then. Anyway, so she asked, a few more questions, and I said, keep waiting, and left into her room, and then came back and said, come with me, and we went to the border control.
How did you feel at the moment she said, come with me?
I was just like, I was sitting there thinking, all right, you've done mindfulness meditation. You like breathe, focus on there's no need to think about shit. The come with me part turned out to be a good thing. We went to the border control booth. She stamped my passport and ticket and said, have a nice trip. So you asked how I am. How am I? I have nothing to complain. I've got 15 minutes of being scared.
Yeah.
That is not the worst kind of circumstance that people are finding themselves in these days.
So you had initially decided to leave after Putin basically announced the invasion. It was after one of the two speeches he gave right for the invasion that you found kind of unsettling. And then, so you were in the first wave, and you were only going back for practical reasons and temporarily to begin with. But so okay, well, congratulations. Let me start by asking you, and again, I know that you always emphasize when we talk that, look, there are whole parts of Russian society you're not in much contact with. And there are a lot of things you don't understand. You can report fairly reliably about what it's like within your social circle and so on.
That's only gotten worse.
In the sense of what? I mean, first of all, we should say obviously, you're a relatively, the nationalists, the Russian nationalists that I follow on Twitter, would almost have had a low opinion of you to begin with, as what they would think of as cosmopolitan, westernized, right? Not truly deeply Russian in a sense, right? That's the way they look at you. These are the biggest boosters of the invasion, and there are those, right?
Right.
Am I right about this division? First of all, like, you're in this part of society, they're in that, and they don't like you.
I mean, a Russian nationalist, probably would have something bad to say about me. Does not mean that, like, everybody who is not cosmopolitan would have, like, you saw when we started talking, a guy walked past in the background. That's a friend of my wife. They're both from a smaller northern town, Arkhangelsk. His job is to fix cars, specialized on engines. That's pretty fucking Russian. Very cold city, very up there.
You mean a car that doesn't work?
No, a man who works with his hands, and and I don't think he knows English very well. But we're totally on the same page as to the war and to other things in life. So it's not that the division is so strict, like if you speak English, you're not Russian.
Do you have a sense for how widespread his sentiment is among, and what exactly is his sentiment? He was opposed to the war from the beginning, or did he not think about it much until mobilization? Or
no, he was opposed from the beginning. I don't really know anybody personally who is not. It's like a 2 degrees of separation between me and somebody who is for the war or doesn't care. Everybody from my social circle, people from different cities, it's not only Moscow and St. Petersburg, were shocked and appalled to begin with. And then the mobilization, of course, makes things, Arestovich, the presidential advisor of Zelensky, who's a very prominent, very popular politician and a prolific speaker and commentator. He says the mobilization is when the Russian people really, like, the war has gotten to the Russian people. Up until then, you could just go about your life as if there is no war. Okay, Coca-Cola is not as readily available as before, and some clothing stores have been closed, and you can't access Facebook or something. But you have your job, and prices have risen, but you're not in physical danger. Mm-hmm. And now it has become much more immediate, and you look at the numbers of men who have left just in these few days since the mobilization. So it has become more immediate for a lot of people.
But you don't purport to have a sense for kind of the distribution of opinion. I mean, initially, the polls, for what they're worth, because obviously, in a more authoritarian society, people might be reluctant to answer pollsters honestly. But for what it's worth, the polls had showed that the large majority of Russians at the beginning said they supported the war. Do you kind of not even claim to have a sense for what the actual lay of the land either was then or is now, opinion-wise?
Yeah, I don't know. If you compare the 2 points in time, I think the number of people who are against the war has risen, and it's partly because of selfish concerns. It's while it's happening somewhere else, you can more easily be for it. When it's you who's going to go kill or die, you might start having second thoughts. I do not trust those polls for a number of reasons. Like, I don't trust the people who do the polls, and then you're asking a person in Russia, in a place that has become more and more sort of authoritarian, totalitarian, whatever adjective you want to use, over time, in a case, in a state of the special operation, they call it. In that context, to ask somebody, do you support it or not, is, are you willing to speak out loudly, and knowing that you might face even jail sentence for that. And that's not the same thing as asking an American who they support at a presidential election or something.
Okay.
But yeah, the number of people who are against the war, I think, has risen substantially because more information has come out. You can close your eyes to it for a certain amount of time, but you will start hearing about the atrocities that are committed. You will see the pictures of cities that are being destroyed. That it's been a little more than half a year. So it doesn't seem like a very limited special operation. Now there is a draft. That also doesn't seem like there's a lot of lies coming out from the government. The numbers that they say, when they announced mobilization, Shoigu, the defense minister, said that we lost. He had like a very specific number to a person. It's like 5,600 something Russian soldiers died,
which is
and so
which has got to be low.
Yeah, I mean, it's like 5,000 died, and so we're now gonna need to have 300,000 more drafted. That doesn't seem to add up. And then that number, people don't trust either. The fact that he said it's 300,000, because in the actual decree or whatever that's called, there's one secret point. Like, you could read the decree online, but one is redacted, and they say that's where the numbers are listed. So we don't know. And from just talking to people, when the COVID pandemic started, it took a while for me to start having these, like, oh, this person got sick or that person got sick. With this mobilization, a couple days in, I know a person who knows a person.
Who's been mobilized, who's been conscripted.
Yeah, and not one. Like, it's pretty widespread, and it's not evenly distributed too. Like, the fact that I know people, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, that is telling, because from what we can tell, it actually is slanted heavily towards smaller towns and villages and non-Russian populations. So yeah, I think it's pretty widespread, and we don't know whether there's going to be like the first wave, the second wave, the third wave. We don't know what number they're settling on for now. If they are settling on a number, it may be just a slow process of get more and more people in.
Now, you talked about just now, you alluded to, information circulating, including, images of cities that had been bombed out and of atrocities. How widely is that stuff circulating? Do you think a high percentage of the Russian people have seen clear evidence of Russian atrocities, as well as images of bombed out cities?
I don't think a lot of them, I don't think the majority has seen images, but they probably at least have heard the accusations. And at that point, it would seem to me that either you want to look it up and figure out what you think, in which case you will easily find those images.
Because pretty much everyone has internet access now.
Yeah, the internet I mean, maybe not everybody, but yeah, it's pretty widespread. If you want to look it up, you'll find it. It will take a little bit of effort, right? It's not like, the websites on which I've seen those images, you can't access without VPN. All of the free media in Russia has been banned, as well as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Well, most people don't have VPN, right?
That's right, and some who, and then the VPN services have been under attack, and not all of them are working. So yeah, there's like obstacles, but I think after you've heard, listen, there are pictures that you can look for, and they're horrific, then it's on you to go and look it up, and it's not like impossible to find them. It's not very, very hard. It just takes a little bit of effort, maybe. My guess is, a person who, say in April, says, no, we're doing the correct thing, there are Nazis in Ukraine and Russia needs to protect itself from the collective West and all of that kind of stuff. If you tell them you should look those images up, you probably will meet some resistance, and I don't think they're going to go ahead and look them up right away. But I think as the time goes on, especially now with the mobilization, you might know a person who's been drafted. You might be a person like that yourself. You might be a mother of such person. You might be a mother whose son left in February and has not come back. It is going to spread. Like before we had social media, we still had like rumors and word of mouth.
Well,
so
Putin is seems to be backtracking. He's clearly mindful and concerned about this reaction. I mean, only today, and I should say, we're taping this a few days before it'll go public. Only one day before it'll be available to paid non-zero newsletter subscribers. But today is Thursday, October 6th. I heard, because things are changing fast enough that who knows what things will be like in 3 or 4 days. But I heard this morning that Putin was saying, there were mistakes. Some people were included in eligibility for mobilization who shouldn't have been. And, this is the second kind of walk back I've seen. They're clearly concerned. And
this kind of thing is almost traditional, it's like, it's almost a Soviet trope. Like there are excesses in localities, it's the general thrust is everything how it's supposed to be. But yeah, there's like this particular head of the military office in this particular locality screwed it up, and we're going to fix that. And there's a lot of that, you take 2 steps forward, then you have to take a half a step back, and then people breathe a little easier than when you took the 2 steps forward. So they always do this kind of thing.
Right. So I want to ask you, what are some of the major misconceptions you think in the West about how Russians broadly view the world, how Putin views the world, how some sector of Russia views the world. But first, I want to throw out a candidate that's relevant to what we just discussed, which is that I think in the West, among people broadly, I guess, there's sometimes this idea that in, autocracies, like dictators are these people who don't need to worry about what the people think. Because they're dictators, they can just say, we're going to do this, we're going to invade this country, I get to decide, it's not a democracy. I've always thought it's almost closer to the opposite. They are often so insecure about their legitimacy because they haven't been recently elected in any kind of legitimate election or something, that they worry a lot about public opinion. They certainly put a lot of resources into manipulating it. So I think I've always thought, well, actually, this is a cognitive empathy issue, because I think, and I'm about to write about an example of this in the newsletter, a specific example before long, but if this is also related about how hard it is to exercise cognitive empathy toward enemies. There's a lot of themes here, but I've noticed that when people in the West assess a Putin speech, they don't give much time to the possibility that it's a product of political calculation, right? He wants to send this message. He wants to assuage this part of the public or inspire this part of the public. They take it as if it's an actual literal, it's just a straightforward statement of his actual beliefs and view of the world. No, we would never do, we tend not to do that with Western politicians. It's the opposite. If you say, well, maybe Biden said that because he actually believes it, you'd say, well, that's so naive. I mean, he's a politician. This is totally a political calculation. With Putin, it's like the opposite. It's like we are so unaware that there are domestic political forces he's responding to. Some are at the elite level, he in various senses. Some are at the grassroots level. At least that's my take, is that the West underestimates the role of political forces in shaping his behavior and policy.
Well, so in terms of the public opinion, my understanding is they do have their own sort of internal service to measure public opinion. They do their own focus groups and polls for that are not released. They get leaked sometimes, but they're not released. This is just for internal understanding of how much support he has. It actually, I've seen it argued that it is these kinds of polls that taught him that war is a good thing, because his approval ratings have gone up during the Chechen wars, during the annexation of Crimea. So it would make sense that he would learn that this is a tool that he can use to get more people behind him. It is not the same thing, of course, as in Western democracies, where the polls translate to election results. That he doesn't have to worry about at all. So the polls is something to measure the temperature, to figure out like how much unrest you might see if you take a certain action. But then again, like the reason we're not seeing as massive protests as we've seen like 10 years ago in Russia is not because he's become more popular. Like there was, if you look at annexation of Crimea 2014, there were pretty big protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg and in other cities. I attended one. It was a good showing. And you haven't seen that since the beginning of the war. This is not because fewer people, are against an actual conflict with people dying than against annexation of Crimea. That's the reverse of the situation. But now the leaders of the protests have been either jailed or killed or left the country. And going to a protest, it was risky then. It's much riskier now. I think the first day since the mobilization, there were something like 1,000, maybe a little more than 1,000 people detained after a protest. And I think a fifth of them have been drafted.
Right. That's a real disincentive to protest.
That's another.
If you're going to be sent to the front lines.
Yeah. Which is it also, the other thing about this mobilization, which takes away the support for the war, is just poorly executed.
Yeah.
There are a lot of videos of these people who have been conscripted, and they don't have equipment. They, in one case, they got rusty, machine guns. There's a video of like a, I don't know, the English equivalent of her position, but there's a woman who's instructing people. Sorry, just need to. I told you I have plumbing issues.
Nikita, for people just listening, is working on the plumbing in his new Armenian apartment. If you
there's a video of one
or anything, just ask.
There's a woman telling there's like all these new recruits in front of her, and she says, "Call your mother. She will send you some money because you are gonna need to buy as whatever you can for your own equipment." And she says, "Guys, don't laugh, but get some menstrual pads and tampons. Do you know why tampons?" They go, "No." She says, "That's for bullet wounds. You put it inside, they soak in the blood, and they stop the bleeding." There's a lot of that kind of stuff. There are a lot of people who are there are videos of people just getting drunk on their way to wherever, and then it turns out that this wherever is like a field, and they're just left in the field, and they just burn fires and
in
get
Ukraine.
drunk.
In Ukraine?
No, in Russia.
Yeah.
This is like untrained people who are gonna go to the war at some point in the future, but like the first locality they're brought to is just in the middle of nowhere. They're not given any equipment. They're not given a tent or anything, and they're just left there. And so that's this is a different kind of reason for a person to be against the war. Not like this is evil. We're killing innocent civilians.
And these circulate again. They circulate on the internet, and they, one way or another, their existence comes to the attention of a lot of Russians.
I think so. I mean, again, it's hard to estimate how many Russians, but yeah, it's more effective than in the old days when we didn't have the internet. And even in those days, you would still get rumors, right?
Well, this must matter because, for one thing, I don't know if you saw this, and I think this is in reference to different set of videos. I think these were videos supposedly in Ukraine of Russian soldiers complaining that they're not getting what they want. And last night on Twitter, I don't know if you've caught wind of this or if it's going to turn out to be true, but I
think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, there's apparently real evidence that some of these videos were staged by people from the Wagner group, these mercenaries, for the purpose of undermining support for the Minister of Defense, in which case this would be a power struggle between possibly this guy, how do you pronounce his name? Prigozhin,
yeah.
Prigozhin, who runs the Wagner group and has always been close to Putin. Of course, the defense minister is very close to Putin, but this would be a sign that we're already seeing a power struggle that Putin doesn't totally have control over. That's an interesting development.
It is, yeah. And Prigozhin and Kadyrov has been, the head of Chechnya. He has been, I mean, he's always been a loose cannon.
Yeah.
But he's been criticizing the overall strategy. He's been criticizing specific generals. And it does seem like a power struggle for more influence and maybe higher positions. And from what I understand, Putin, I don't know about Kadyrov. This is a complicated relationship, I assume, but Prigozhin is said to have been close to Putin, and he's been, he does a lot of different stuff. And one of those things is the Wagner group. And there's that video. And also I was, the first time I saw it, I thought, oh shit, we're finding out, like this is being leaked. And then it took me an hour or something to realize this is probably a part of the marketing campaign.
Is this the prison video?
Yeah. So he's delivering a speech, he's pitching the war to inmates, which, I mean, it's completely, it was hard to imagine this happening a year ago. But yeah, there's just a guy who appears in the prison and everybody's brought to the open space and gives them the pitch, which sounds like something from a Hollywood movie, from the Expendables or something. Stallone should be making these kinds of speeches. He says, like he gives them the thing,
Well, the deal is, if they'll fight for 6 months, they won't have to come back to prison. They'll be free men. That's the thing. And then go ahead about the
That's right. Yeah. And they will be compensated. And if they die, they will be buried as heroes, and their families are going to be compensated. And he has some qualifications. Then he says, now, as to the question of trust and guarantees, well, is there anybody who can get you out of here? There are two that can, God and Allah, and then there's me. But God and Allah are getting you out of here in a wooden box. I get you out of here alive. I do not always return you alive. It's this very,
well,
it's actually kind of like,
my favorite part is when he says, now, if you do go to Ukraine and you change your mind and you decide it was a mistake, you will be shot as a deserter.
that's right.
He's like,
That's
he's not sugarcoating this thing. And
That's
he says, you will be shock troops. In other words, you'll be the guys rushing the trenches, man. This is not, this is, he totally levels with him. This is, you may well die. If you change your mind, we will kill you.
Yeah. I mean, it is structured as there's a call to action at the end. He doesn't give them a lot of time. He says, you got 5 minutes to think about it. He does, lift the ego up, like you would be heroes, you will be compensated. He says that he gives this anecdote about, I don't know what the point was. I guess he was saying like that your chances on survival are pretty high or something, or maybe he's just saying this is the elite little army he has. But he has, my man, he gives a number, I forget what, 50 or something people went into the trenches and slaughtered everybody with knives, and 3 of them died. So it's, you go into the trenches, you kill everybody in, only 3 out of the 50 or however many people die. And I guess he ties it, he says that firstly, there's like qualifications, you need to be not older than a certain age. And then he says, this is roughly, like if you're in good shape, we'll give you an examination and maybe you can get in. And so he gives the story about slaughtering soldiers with knives, and he says, of my people, 3 of them died, 1 of them was 57 or something. Yeah, so that guy is there, and he seems to be fighting for more power, and his career path so far has been pretty damn successful.
Yeah, he's the guy known as Putin's chef because he had a catering business or something that Putin steered a lot of business toward or something.
Yeah, I think this is a horrible, like, just a flounder on the opposition's part to have that nickname to him him still.
Yeah,
I mean, like, I understand, like, that it's like historically, like, we first found out that there was this catering corruption scheme, and so Putin's chef. But then the moment you find out he has a private army that's been fighting on different continents, I think you need to update the nickname. Like, yeah. Putin's butcher or something. Putin's you can come up with something that has a culinary connection and the killing of the people connection.
So I said I would ask you, what are some big misconceptions you encounter among Westerners, and just how some Russians or Putin or anybody looks at the world?
Yeah, I don't know if misconception is how I would put it, and I don't know if this is hard to think about. My take is, when I hear things like Russians believe this, and here's like the way they understand the war or the world or whatever, my sense, there's not a coherent worldview. I think this is mostly emotional, because you see it in conversation. If you're talking to somebody who is, let's say, for the war, and then you point to a contradiction in their thinking, they never go like, oh, I haven't thought about that, right? Or, no, here's the counter argument to that. It's usually like the coherence of the thought is not necessary, because this is how I see it. I don't pretend to be correct about all things, but I'm trying to think about it. Here's my thoughts at the moment, and it feels to me that this is emotional. This is about loyalty and not feeling like a bad person. There's sometimes there's a circular reasoning, especially early in the war. You would see this where, let's say, you point to pictures from Bucha or someplace like that, or we're destroying this city, and the argument for this is fake news would be, we would never do that. Like, this is not us, because why would we do such a horrible thing? And well,
Yeah.
how do you argue against that?
Um,
I'm saying we're doing a horrible thing, and you're saying no, it's horrible, so it can't be us.
yeah.
So my sense, and then there's a lot of frustration these days, and tension between the people who are against. It's not even at this point, it's not just against the war. It's more like you think everything is falling to pieces, and the country is turning to something, has already turned into something completely dark and bizarre, and you need to get the fuck out, or you need to fight, but we don't know how to, this kind of alarmist sort of uh, rhetoric. People who say have a sense of urgency, and the people who either support the war or say, I'm just going to wait until we see how it shakes out.
Now, the sense of kind of descending darkness that begins. Does that go back years and years, or is that something that you're pegging to the beginning of the war, or what?
The war, and the mobilization and the things that we've seen, the various developments we've seen throughout the war, like the guy getting prisoners, murderers out of prison to murder more people in the war, this kind of thing, and a lot of things have happened in the past half a year. So there's a lot of tension between these groups, and a lot of misunderstanding. Like, the cognitive empathy thing is very hard to practice when. And again, it's not just like it's not even, you have to be like in stark contrast. Like, I know a couple. The guy would like to leave. He is not leaving because his wife doesn't want to leave. And when we try to talk to her and understand her perspective, like, I couldn't. Like, my understanding, my own private understanding is, just for whatever reasons, emotional, maybe she's afraid of leaving, maybe she's attached, has like a romantic attachment to the country and the land. One way to formulate it that I think she did at some point is like, if everybody leaves, then we're surrendering the country to these thugs. I don't want to do that. But when she first tried to explain herself to me, it seemed a little bit of a word salad to me. And this is my friend, who I think is smart, who I respect, who is against the war, who thinks that everything that's happening is horrible. But still, to see her perspective, like, okay, so we're on the same page about all of that, and now your husband is in risk of physical danger. He might be drafted. He might be sent to kill or die.
Yeah.
Or if he, disagrees, he might be sent to prison. That instills a sort of sense of urgency, when I look at the situation, and she says, I don't want to leave.
Does she elaborate on why she doesn't want to leave?
Well, I try to summarize some of this. I mean, if I try to talk more about it, it will become, first a little too personal. She didn't give me a permission to talk about this. And also it would enter, I mean, I think here's maybe an obstacle that I see on the path of your cognitive empathy project.
Mm-hmm.
Like, people go to therapy to understand their own motivations in their marriage,
right.
and it takes them years to figure out why I myself act a certain way when a certain behavior, when my wife exhibits a certain behavior. And it takes years to figure out, this thing happened in my childhood and I reacted to it a certain way, and then it became a coping mechanism that persisted for years. In yourself, that's hard to figure out.
Right.
Putin, how much do we know about his inner life? Like, what is it like to be that person? He lives a very, very strange existence compared to most of us. Like, what is how do I imagine the frame of reference? Like, I've been the leader of Russia for 22 years. I wear these shoes with high heels to look taller. I have nuclear weapons at my disposal. I can murder people. Here's my reading list of philosophers from the 19th century. There's a lot there that,
Yeah.
So to put yourself in his shoes and be confident, like, here's how Putin sees the world, that seems tough because, again, sometimes it's hard to understand yourself. And the reason I brought up this example with my friend is, we've talked about this, and I still don't totally understand. My basics, for the time being, my kind of placeholder for understanding her position is, I think there's a lot of emotional stuff going on and she's confused. And that sounds condescending, and I don't want to be condescending to my friend, but I do not understand her perspective.
Let me say a few things. I mean, first of all, in a case like that with your friend, I mean, I have several siblings who voted for Trump, which I certainly didn't do. And so I'm kind of familiar with the plight. In that case, it's not, in a way, it's not deeply puzzling. Well, let me skip that part and say a couple of things. One is that you're definitely right. It's very hard, and as you suggest, it's hard to understand how, in a sense, how you see the world. At least it's hard to understand why you do things, why you react certain ways. Sometimes to predict your own reactions to things. That's all hard, and that's in part because there are cognitive biases that impede your self-understanding, and we know what some of them are. There's some overlap, by the way, between those and the ones you apply to your friends. So if you do something bad, or your friends or allies do something bad, there's a natural tendency to look for extenuating circumstances. Well, I was in a bad mood because I didn't get my nap. My friend was in a bad mood because they didn't get their nap. I was under stress, at work, whatever they were. That you do that with friends and allies. With enemies, including Putin, it's the opposite. He did this bad thing not because he was under political pressure, no circumstances. He's just a bad person. There is that. So we know certain things about kind of patterns of distortion in assessing the way people view the world and why they do things that can be helpful. That said, it's always a probabilistic business. You never know. Well, I personally think you never know anything for sure. I don't know that I'm not in a gooey vat like in the Matrix, but I think I have 99.99% confidence that I'm not, but you never know anything for sure. I'd say the same thing with
mine
Putin.
has gotten lower.
Well, mine's getting lower. But I'd say, as you know, my view is, and of course, part of the problem with the first problem you encounter with cognitive empathy is if you start explaining why somebody did something bad, like, I think if we look at things from Putin's point of view, it's easier to understand how he wound up invading Ukraine. Like, right away, you are besieged with people claiming that you're trying to justify the invasion. And when you think about it, that's a real impediment to discourse broadly. If we can never make an honest attempt to explain why people do bad things because we'll be accused of justifying them, we're going to have to spend the rest of eternity in very consequential darkness as to why bad shit happens, which will handicap us as we try to prevent bad things from happening. Anyway, and this, by the way, this is a fascinating subject in its own right. Why is human psychology set up to conflate explanation with justification? Whole interesting subject in its own right. But I think in the case of Putin, as you know, my view is that the U.S. mismanaged its relationship with Russia going back 25 years. And if we hadn't, there might not have been an invasion of Ukraine, which, again, is not to get Putin off the hook. It was a violation of international law, which I take very seriously. It was an unjustified invasion and so on. But it's, and to get back to, well, how much do we know about Putin? if you ask me, in order to do the things we should have done to manage our relationship with Russia better, you wouldn't have to have deep penetrating insights into Putin demand. Right. But you'd have to make basic assumptions about what kinds of things people take as disrespect, how people respond to evidence of disrespect, maybe add to that the fact that, we have reason to believe that Putin has a chip on his shoulder. As you said, he's like a short guy. He learned martial arts in his teen years, possibly as a way to make sure, not get picked on in the playground. Who knows? But we know there is reason to think that he responds particularly to slights. In fact, Fiona Hill said that to Obama when she was an advisor. And by her account, she said to Obama, don't ridicule him in public. He'll respond badly. And Obama goes out and does that, at least on one occasion. And she's like tearing out her hair. But anyway, so I'll give you an example. The other compounding factor, I think, is, look, as the Cold War ended, Russia it's accustomed to being one of the two great powers of the world as part of the Soviet Union. It's undergoing a significant diminution in status, okay? Putin is an autocratic leader, so he's probably going to make a closer connection between his identity and the identity of his country than is often made in democracies where you change your leader every 4 or 8 years. Over time, that's probably going to grow. So you take all this into account, and it seems to me it's a pretty good bet that if you do a series of things we did, and I can enumerate them if you want, he's going to respond badly. And it's going to increase the chances that something explosive will happen. If you want to go back to the very beginning, it's like 9/11 happens. He is, as I recall, like the first leader to call Bush and say, we're here if you need us, okay? Within months, Bush did something he knew Putin really, really, really didn't want him to do, which is get out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Putin had said, we really don't want this. Within months, Bush is like, fuck you, kid. And by the way, is stupid from America's point of view. One of the stupidest of the many stupid things Bush did. There's no logic behind getting out of that treaty. And I could go on, and someday I've told some of this story, but there were warnings, all along the way by people from the CIA saying, do not, Ukraine and NATO is a total red line. Okay. We were warned in 2008 by Bill Burns, who is now head of the CIA, because he was ambassador to Russia. He's like, this is fucking crazy. Do not talk about Ukraine and NATO. He didn't put in quite those words. It was very clear. And so, on the one hand, so-called realists have made the argument that NATO, as a national security matter, Ukraine membership is going to be a problem for Russia. And what I'm saying is to think that actually the problem is deeper than that. The problem is a problem of status and the way and of kind of pride and insult and so on. And you have to take into account those psychological factors. I think to make that leap, and again, you never know anything for sure, but to say in a probabilistic way, this Ukraine NATO policy is also a problem for that reason. Leave aside Putin's actual national security calculations. It's what we know about A, human psychology, B, Putin's own psychology, got a chip on his shoulder, C, the position Russia is in now with its status dropping and that being a sensitive issue, seems to me that should tell you to proceed with caution, okay? I don't think that calls for any blinding insights into Putin's, we don't need a Freudian analysis of his childhood to say, pretty good chance this is not going to increase the chances of a harmonious relationship with Russia. And it increases the chances something very bad happening. Burns predicted the bad thing. A number of people did. So
So
that's
I have
my
a few reactions, and I'll probably forget the two while I'm talking about the first one, but I brought it up in some conversation we had before. There's this interview that I keep coming back to from 2019 with Arestovich, who I already mentioned in this conversation. This is advisor to Zelensky, where he predicts the war. He predicts pretty accurately. And the prediction is, he says, listen, Ukraine is at the fork in the road. We can, geographically speaking, we cannot afford neutrality. Neutrality costs a lot. You need your own standing army. We need to be either in the one camp or the other. Either we join NATO or Russia is going to consume us in 10 to 12 years. I don't want to get consumed by Russia. We've been there. We've been in the Soviet Union, didn't like that. I want to try the NATO thing. If we do that, if we get a roadmap to join in NATO, Russia will start a war. And it's going to be a big war. And the point would be to destroy our infrastructure completely so that we are not appealing as a NATO member. And the reporter says, well, which of these options is better? And Arestovich, who I like, by the way, but he strikes me as a kind of a sociopath. He's like, throughout his whole time, he's just very calm and has a sense of humor and irony. And he says, of course, a big war with Russia and a victory in that war, and NATO membership as the result of that war. Now, I don't judge this thing because I don't think I'm in a position to judge. I definitely wouldn't want to be myself in that position to make these kinds of choices. But my point is, he does seem to have an understanding of Putin's psyche and a predictable, of the power to predict the consequences of these moves. And he laid it out like, these are the choices. Here's the one that I'm choosing. And I understand the logic of choosing. He wants Ukraine to be a sovereign nation, and he thinks the chances of that is lower if they did nothing. And I don't exactly know what he thought, like how this process of being consumed by Russia would look like, but that's his perspective. Another reaction to what
this
you
is 2019,
said,
you said?
This is 2019. Yeah. And he's as I said, a prolific speaker, and he talks about Putin's worldview now, and I think he does have a good insight. Another thing I wanted to say is, you talked about how we perceive his speeches, and you say people in the West tend to think he's actually saying what he thinks, which, yeah, it's not how we see this in Russia. But I did feel that way about that first. So, like, the two big seminal speeches he's made recently were the one when he was announcing the recognition of the breakaway republic as an independent states, history of Ukraine, it's not a real nation, this whole thing. And then the most recent one, when they signed the documents accepting these regions into the Russian Federation, and he made a different speech. And I can come up with the argumentation, but it's more like I'm just listening to the thing and it feels a certain way. And the first one felt to me like, let me level with you. Here's what I think.
Wait, and the first one was which speech?
When he gave this historical analysis of like why these regions should be a part of Russia, basically, that Ukraine is not a real country.
This is before the invasion.
Before the invasion, yeah. And that one did seem to me as like, here's what I think. Here's why this makes sense to me. And then the most recent one, before the signing of the documents of accepting the regions in Russia, seemed like a complete, calculated, crafted thing with certain parts targeted at certain demographics within and outside of Russia. He had a little bit for the anti-woke people, because we are on the side of like a family being a mother and a father and children, not parent one, parent two. There's an anti-colonial thing, like Russia is this anti-colonial power and America is the empire that has been dominating the world, which is like, you just talked about like Russia being the ancestor of the imperial Russia, and you're like the first speech before the invasion, it seemed to me like the summary is like, I think empires are good. I think it's good to have a few regional empires. Each has a sphere of influence, and the empire on the other side of the world does not meddle in our business over here. In this speech, he's talking because he wants to appeal to India and China, and maybe even to like some left-wing intellectuals in the US. So he's talking about the kind of anti-colonial thing. And there's just like, the whole speech is like just this menu of things for different little categories to be appealed to.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I that all makes sense to me. On the, well, a couple of things on the, as for the speech that you think genuinely represented his point of view, where he said, you know, Ukraine has never been a real country, and you know, there is this deep Russian historical connection to it. I do think he believes that stuff, and you know, and of course, look, Ukraine, it is not an ethnically homogeneous country. I think that's part of what he meant in both cases, right? It has this Russian part and so on, and
Russia isn't ethnically homogeneous either.
Right. There aren't many, but you tend to focus on the cases that it's convenient to focus on, right?
Yeah.
And but what I would say about that is kind of, I mean, if that is supposed to mean that it was inevitable, this was his view all along, and this is the way it's presented in the West. This was his view all along. So the invasion was inevitable. You know, I would say when you see any big like breakup, friends break up, marriage breaks up, and one of the friends just starts going, you know, you've always been like this, and you've always been like that, and you've always been like this. Okay. That is, on the one hand, that is actually a view they've held a long time. You know, in any marriage or friendship, you're keeping track of your grievances and you're not articulating them because it's not in your interest to articulate them because the relationship is so fundamentally working. Okay. And then you go, shit, if you thought that all along, you should have gotten out of this this was inevitable. Well, sometimes it wasn't inevitable, right? It's right, because of something the friend did within the last few days. But now you're listing all these grievances that go way back, and you're revealing that you've always had this view. There's always been a dark side to your view of your friend, right? You've always had your complaints. And I that's my view of how we've managed our relationship with Russia. You know, it's like it didn't have to come to this. And which leads us to the 2019 speech, but I'll pause and let you go ahead.
That's what I wanted to bring up. Yeah, I think fundamentally Arestovich is right. I don't have the same certainty that he does about like, and I would love to hear. I just haven't found like a speech where he lays it out in more detail. But yeah, Putin has always wanted and tried to keep Ukraine close, you know, to install his people in power. And I think if it wasn't for NATO, I mean, it's not just NATO, because I think
the EU is a big issue with him. Yeah,
EU is a big issue. I think EU. I think my feeling, my understanding is there's the big grievances are NATO, and I think his view of the revolutions, of the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan, is I don't think he believes in like people's movement. I don't think he thinks that happens in history. I think there are people behind it and there's money behind it. And in case with the Ukrainian revolutions that moved the country westward, he thinks these are like special operations by the US. And I think those are the two, in his worldview, those are the two, like, you're actively trying to coerce Ukraine into this relationship, and then maybe Ukraine is willing, and then he's bitter about that. But yeah, if it wasn't for NATO, I think he would go his, the way he was going before that, which is try to install his guy into power. There's going to be an election. He's going to give some money to people who are pro-Russia. Maybe not just give money, Prigozhin, apart from having a personal army, is running that troll farm, which I've heard has become more effective than when we once talked about it some years ago. So he would try to, peacefully have it so that there is a puppet regime in Ukraine.
Yeah, he always wanted, I think he always thought of himself as, we're a great power. America gets its sphere of influence. When a regime, when there's a regime it doesn't like in its neighborhood, it invades, which we've done repeatedly. Not in the last 20 years. We've invaded countries further away from us more recently. But he absolutely thinks that. And the question is, could we have reconciled that view with a better outcome than we've got now, which is tens of thousands of dead people, millions of displaced people, a non-trivial chance of nuclear war or wider war in Europe? Like, we're in a bad place, okay? It's like, can you imagine that we could have steered things to a place where Ukraine's fate would be better than it currently looks to me? Because I don't think this is over. I don't think. I mean, they've done a good job of fending off Russia, but I don't think the happy ending Ukraine envisions, where they push Russian troops all the way back over the border, I don't think that's happening. And I think we got a lot of dead people between now and the end of this thing, and possibly nuclear war and so on. So, first of all, like, with all due respect for that Ukrainian politician's aspirations, those are not the only consideration in the world. And I would say that, but I would also say I'm not convinced that we had to get to the point. Well, I'd also say it sounds to me like maybe in Ukraine at that point there was actually a motivation to worsen relations with Russia. It sounds like they wanted war. Was he part of the Zelensky administration?
He was. I don't know the history in detail. My understanding, there's been like he was, and then he was, and then he was, but yeah. Because, by 2019 he was arguing, going to vote for Zelensky.
Because part of the Russian story, I have no idea how much truth there is to this, but is that there was this ongoing war between the separatists, who were Russia supported, and Ukraine.
Right.
And there was a growing sense that in Russia, I believe, that, we were starting to arm, U.S. was starting to arm Ukraine, which had begun by 2019, I'm pretty sure. And their story is Ukraine was using that to more and more aggressively prosecute its war, which in their mind consisted of killing ethnic Russians in Ukraine, right? They took this very much as like an ethnic kind of nationalist thing. So there's that. It sounds to me like, having heard what the Zelensky confidant said about how basically we welcome war with Russia, maybe Ukraine was being more provocative than was optimal. I don't know, but that's a footnote. That's a footnote. What my main point is, I don't think things had to get to the point that they were in 2019. It would have taken real creative diplomacy, I admit, that would have certainly included, back in 2014, trying to work out a creative solution to the EU thing, which we didn't try to do, which would be like, well, maybe there's a way for Ukraine to pursue this associate membership with the EU without burning the bridges to Russia's economy that Russia doesn't want to see burned. And so maybe there's a creative way. But I'd also say, you said Putin doesn't believe in authentic, popular revolt. Well, this is a common problem in politics. In the U.S., when there is a regime, even the prospect of regime materializing that we don't like in our hemisphere, there are definitely a lot of people who don't want to give much thought to the possibility that the problem is that a lot of people in that country are unhappy and don't like the U.S. It's always like it's a communist plot, right? So this is a tendency, and it isn't just about your view of whether there's such a thing as popular will. It's about a reluctance. It's about a human tendency when they see a nearby threat to start looking for, dark actors behind it, as opposed to it actually reflecting badly on something you did, right?
Right. I guess Putin's views on that would have been different if there were pro-Russian revolutions in these countries, but that doesn't tend to happen.
Well, in fact, also what he would say is, look, the people marching in Kyiv, they weren't from Eastern Ukraine, okay? They were from Western Ukraine. That's what he would say. There's a bunch of people and he'd be right. And there's a bunch of people in Eastern Ukraine, and they're ethnic Russians. That's what I'm just telling you what he'd say.
No, he would.
But the other thing is, this is a good example of where I think we could have done less to encourage that kind of reaction. I personally think the U.S. was involved in the Maidan revolution in ways it shouldn't have been. And, to an extent that some people, especially on the left, refer to it as the Maidan coup. I'm happy to call it a revolution, but it was a violent overthrow of a government. I mean, the guy fled, the relatively pro-Russian president of Ukraine fled for fear of his life, and there were guys in the streets, and there's arguments
who started the violence.
There's arguments about who shot first, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
It's a non-democratic transfer of power, and I think the U.S.
But there's been an election since then. It's not that Zelensky got in as a result of that coup.
No, that's true. Right. Although the way it's cast in Russia is, well, we don't know who would be president if it hadn't been for the coup, but the view in Russia is that this is all an extension of what they call the coup. So anyway, that's the view. I'm just saying it's a good cognitive empathy exercise, I think, is to always try to force yourself to come up with what would be the corresponding question viewed from your side, like what I just did, like, okay, but does America ever assert the existence of dark plots when actually there's popular resistance? If so, then maybe this is a human tendency. If so, maybe we should take it into account in our policy and not do things that foster that dark view, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, to get back to that 2019 interview, like the way Arestovich presents the fork in the road, we have to be either in this camp or that camp, that at least the way I read this now is like that's reflective of both of the sides, right? Like Putin doesn't want to let go, and then America with NATO as the military apparatus around the world is also a kind of an empire.
Yeah.
It's not that he says, I want to be in one of those camps. He says, I don't think we can afford neutrality.
Yeah.
And these are the two choices. And here's the choice that I like better.
I mean,
so I do think it's generally like I've been throughout the last few months, I've been like, I'm reluctant to just accept this worldview, but it's getting harder and harder to not.
Wait, which worldview?
To see like the way the world organized politically as just fundamentally dark. It's games that are about power and deals and money, and most people at the top are okay with sacrificing lives or well-being of other people, and that's just how it's generally run. And it's just we outsource. Like America doesn't have war on its soil, but it has a lot of wars in other parts of the world, and I feel whatever the feeling is, like the war has become this like urgent thing that is the topic of every conversation since this started in Ukraine. But wars have been happening all over the place, and for me, they were just something in the news. Like I still don't have like a good understanding of exactly what is going on in Syria, let's say, because I was just never a person who would read up on the most recent military conflict someplace. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, let me say, first of all, wisdom is coming to you sooner than it came to me. I mean, I would describe my own current stage in the evolution of my thought as like, I'm more and more cynical about the way the world works. And like, I'm old. That's kind of late dawn. I mean, I was always, look, I was never Pollyanna. And maybe I've been getting steadily more cynical. But, and you know, that partly in a way, this helps explain maybe the way I look at this. One area where I've become more cynical is I've developed, I think, really just a clearer understanding of how U.S. foreign policy is made. It ain't pretty. And it is not about actually pursuing America's actual interests as I see them. And I don't even have a narrow view of America's interests. I want America to be very involved in the world, cultivating respect for international law, you know, building international institutions. And in that way, I really do think I hate the thought that Putin will come out of this ahead, because it's a positive reinforcement for a flagrant violation of international law. And here I differ from a lot of people who otherwise agree with me about mistakes America made and blah, blah, blah. You know, is there just like, does America really have an interest in Ukraine? Yes, I think America has an interest wherever something's going to happen that influences the evolution of international norms and laws. I mean, unfortunately, America has done as much to erode those norms and laws as Russia, but that's another question. Each case matters. Anyway, that's a digression, but I share your cynicism.
Can I ask you about one more question in the cynical field that we've entered? I think I've heard this from a bunch of Russians, maybe even a couple of Armenians, that you know, okay, Putin's horrible, and it's horrible that this war is happening, and you know, not removing any blame from Putin, but this is a successful. What we're seeing is a success of the strategy of the U.S. You're not losing your own people; it's Ukrainians who are doing the fighting. They're successful at the counteroffensive. Russia is being isolated. You can see Russia breaking apart as a result of this war. And then you'll have Ukraine in your camp, and Russia would be falling apart. And so here, Putin, apart from being evil, he's also just not good at what he thinks he's good at. He just was played for a fool, and he's going to lose. And the U.S., cynically, is there. It's not a blunder. It's a successful operation that is within the overall strategy of the country. What do you think about that kind of perspective?
Well, I'm not as cynical as some like on the left, and maybe it's partly because I'm not as far left as some on the left, in the sense that I don't think this is like this orchestrated, you know, like, oh, cool, he's getting sucked into our trap. Good, there will be a war. I don't think that, but I do think that one reason we did not, I think, make any serious attempt at pre-war diplomacy that would have prevented the invasion, and there are a number of reasons for that, but I think one was we did have this simplistic, zero-sum Cold War mindset. There's a piece I wrote, and if people want to Google an ominous murder in Moscow, it's the title of the Non-Zero newsletter piece I wrote. It was about the killing of Darina Dugina, the daughter of this prominent nationalist Dugin. It's unclear whether they meant to kill her or her father. In any event, New York Times reported yesterday the Ukrainian government did this on Russian soil, murdered a civilian. They may have been aiming at a different civilian. Murder is murder. This is a war crime. I'm sorry. I think, as I understand it, you're not supposed to target civilians, period, as I understand it, intentionally. And
I mean, honestly, to me, the concept of a war crime still is a weird one. Like, to me, a war is a crime.
Right. Well, invasion is a crime. Putin committed a crime just by invading. But then it's interesting because once you're in a war, the rules for what constitutes a crime are symmetrical, right? So the things Russia's not supposed to do are the same things Ukraine is not supposed to do, even though Ukraine was invaded. That's the way it works. So that's why I say, and look, I only emphasize this because I just think the American media is not doing a very even-handed job of covering this as a rule. And it's important to understand what both sides do wrong. In that case, my complaint at the time I wrote this was that this could be escalatory. It could inflame the Russian nationalists. I think that, so far as I can tell, was the net effect. It may have played a role in getting us where we are. But anyway, what I want to say is there's a different part of that piece where I focus on a podcast done shortly after the invasion featuring a high-ranking State Department official named Derek Chollet. He reports directly to Antony Blinken. And he says, no, we refuse to talk about the NATO issue with Russia before the war. So that's the first clear statement that we just said, no, we're not going to talk about this, which was, of course, high among the ostensible on the list, arguably at the top of the list of ostensible demands that might have prevented invasion. Who knows if taken more seriously. But what I want to say is the host kind of pushes back. This is like in March, and the host says, wait a second, you didn't even discuss it? He says, no, look, NATO's not, it's not an offensive threat to Russia. And the host, who's very smart, says, well, wait a second, you've heard of the security dilemma. Nations always take things you don't see as offensive. You see them as defensive. They see them. This is a classic of human nature and political science. Right. And the guy's response is, look, this is not a win for Russia. Okay. Right. I don't see this as a win for Russia. And you can see what he's thinking. He's thinking this has turned out to be a trap for Putin. And what he's not saying, but his thinking is, so it's good for us. Mm-hmm. And I have one, just something to say to this guy. No, you stupid motherfucker. War is not a zero-sum game. And if we have a nuclear war, I'm gonna, and I'm alive, I'm gonna spend the rest of my life highlighting this idiotic framework that our State Department seems to have entered the war with, which is that it was a zero-sum thing. Bad for Russia is good for us. That is, sorry, but that is just so, it's wrong on so many levels. Nuclear war is only the most dramatic illustration.
And I won't get into it. Doesn't have to be nuclear for for a lot of people to die and
not just that, but to impede cooperation on a ton of things we urgently need to cooperate on to prevent
that too,
biological warfare or something. A lot of problems out there. So I got a little too animated there perhaps, but the answer is, on the one hand, I'm not as conspiratorial about the Americans fighting, being willing to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian as it's put. But I think now that's where we are. The U.S. is like, maybe people at the State Department are starting to go, scratch their heads and go, oh, I suppose this thing could go too far, couldn't it? Yeah, it could. But by and large, I think we have been viewing this in this simplistic zero-sum Cold War framework. And so I would say some cynicism is warranted. Now, we've talked a long time. All I'll say, there's other things I could say about the 2019 speech. All I will say is, I'm far from sure that pre-war diplomacy could have prevented the war. I see no excuse for not trying, which was our position apparently. But my view is we've been mismanaging the relationship with Russia for 25 years. And the farther back you go, the more I feel that if it had been done right from there on out, the chances would be higher that there would not be a war. I certainly think that if you just start in the Clinton era and just do things very differently in ways tons of people urgently recommended they be done, by the way, sages in the world of American foreign policy were saying, no, don't start expanding NATO. And I think I'd like to add to that.
apart from, so I agree with you, but apart from like don't expand NATO and be more respectful and so forth, there's also, this is like Navalny's point, that for a long time the West was fine taking in Russian oligarch money without asking a lot of questions about where this money is coming from, allowing Putin's regime to continue evolving in this corrupt fashion, and use that to then buy the villas and the yachts and have parties in the West. And if there was more of a, like, here's the way we do things, there has to be, it's not just we have laws here in the UK and you do whatever you want as long as you bring the cash. We're not going to ask if there's like if there was an effort to peacefully, on sort of like business like terms, convince Putin that democratic institutions and the rule of law are actually good to have, and you'll be better off if you have them. And here are the incentives. We would also be in a better place.
There's a related
This
thing.
is again not to remove any blame from either Putin's shoulders or the Russian people's shoulders or the Russian politicians' shoulders. And, there's a ton of blame to go around, but this is just a side point.
There's a related thing. I think one thing Putin exploits is the fact that, when he took over, Russia was in a very bad way economically. I think you experienced the 1990s. I think most people in America don't understand. Things got really bad, right?
Yeah.
And that was, I think, blamed by a number of people on, at least partly on the West. Like, we came in, hey, we got this great system. Why don't you try capitalism? And of course, the transition was fraught with problems. And, oligarchs, people who were already inside the circles of power in Moscow, exploited the transition to a mass economic power, and oligarchs and so on.
There's a distinction that is very clear in the West and is not at all clear from the Russian perspective. Like, there were American advisors within the Yeltsin's government or like advising the Yeltsin's government how to go with the transition.
Mm-hmm.
And for a Russian, this is like, wait, you came in and you advised, and we've gotten what we've gotten. And whenever you bring it up with an American, you always hear, those were not like the state representatives. Those are individual people. There's a private, like, economists you can hire to advise you.
Right.
This is not America doing this. But
right.
For post-Soviet Russia, this is America doing it. We've been closed off from the world. And then you got some Americans, supposedly experts in how markets work, advise you on this.
And it wouldn't surprise me if Bill Clinton suggested some economists. I wouldn't say the U.S. government, had a hands-off attitude. At this, it's a very challenging problem for a country to make an economic transition like that without this kind of thing happening. But in any event, the West is blamed by many. Putin was seen as a kind of savior because after he became president, things started getting better. And anyway, one thing he, exploits, I believe, is there's just this idea that there was, many kinds of politicians do this. There was a golden age where things were much better in this country. We were truer to our identity, this and that. And then these bad people spoiled it. And I think a lot of Americans don't realize the extent to which Russians are willing to believe the Americans were the bad people to begin with. And that is part of the context in which, Putin is elaborating the rest of the narrative about the current threat from the West and American hegemony and so on.
Yeah.
So briefly, maybe, I'm looking forward to these conversations with you because things will evolve in Russia and it'll be good to check in every once in a while. Briefly, we should, as for this project, the Cognitive Empathy Project, I'm writing a book about it. I just kind of said to newsletter readers, I'm going to be trying this thing, which honestly, I'm a little, I find kind of scary of kind of trying to research and write a book and share a fair amount of that with readers. A certain amount of it only with paid subscribers. In cases where it's actually what may be a written part of the book, that's partly to comply with the publisher's expectations, including contractual ones. But so I'm at the beginning of this, and I know some things we're going to try. I don't know how exactly it's going to work out, but I'm interested in your thoughts. I mean, you've already had some kind of wild ideas involving AI. I'd be happy for an AI to write the book. And I would like to give a prompt to what is it? GPT-3? Is that the essay writer?
Mm-hmm.
Like, just write my damn book. That would be the prompt. No, it wouldn't be. That wouldn't be. But something, something about cognitive empathy. See what happens.
It's worth trying it out and seeing what happens, and then learning from what happens. I think this is my current take on these systems. Is I'm not sure whether it's good or a bad thing or what, and what uses it has, but I think we're right now in the stage of development of this thing where you've gotten this toy and you can figure out whether it's good for something, and you do it by experience. You try it out. You have a project. You know what you're working on, and you can take a dozen of different angles in your first couple of sessions as to what this thing might be useful for. You write an argument and you say, provide a counter argument to this, and you see what it comes up to. Or you you feed it your introduction and you say, write the table of contents, or what is the book cover going to look like? Write an ad for this book. Provide the criticism that this book has gotten from, and then name a person and see what comes out. Just like this, I'm trying to think it right now as I speak. You can come up with things that might be useful in some way in the creative process.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not saying let the AI write the book.
I'm totally game letting the I almost worry that if I give it a specific prompt, it'll do a sufficiently good job of something that I could use, rewritten in rewritten form, a few paragraphs of that. I'll be like, whoa, am I plagiarizing an AI? Is this, I don't know. But we'll see. There's a related thing that I won't elaborate on because we've been, we're running kind of overtime. But you, by way of illustrating the way it responds to prompts, you sent me an essay you had the AI generate. The prompt was like, Putin isn't real or something. What was it?
Yeah, I've done, the idea is not mine. It's kind of like in the Russian folk mythology, there are different versions of the idea that Putin does not exist. It's like he might be a team of lookalikes or a team of androids or a mass hallucination or, bunch of different options. But the premise is Putin does not exist. And when I first got my hands on this GPT-3 thing, I gave it a bunch of different prompts. I asked it to write a horror movie based on this premise, an action movie based on this premise, a political program of, I guess, like an oppositional movement based on the premise that Putin does not exist. And I think I've sent you that last one, the political program. Did I not?
I didn't know that I got the political program, but the you sent me one essay that was a response to the prompt, and a thought I had about that was related to cognitive empathy was, I think you could make the case that as good as the AI is getting at generating essays and art, what it still lacks is cognitive empathy. Because there was, to the extent that I had a critique of that essay, I won't get into detail. It would be, I mean, first of all, it's my view that, better cognitive empathy can solve a lot of problems and make a lot of things better. And one of them is just writing. Often, if you see bad writing, the problem is
and web interfaces.
What's that?
web interfaces. I've heard you complain about the interfaces of the apps.
Totally. Just people designing interfaces and not putting themselves in the shoes of the people who are going to be using them and going like, wait, suppose you weren't this genius software engineer, but were just this like schlub, yeah, it would be different. Wait, I gotta plug in my computer just a second. But anyway, in the case of writing, there's often a failure to really say like, okay, look, I need to have a conception. It's impossible to ever say, yeah, this is there is a kind of, there's no average reader. Your readers are always a bunch of different people, but
right.
There's value in having this kind of conception of a reader. And I would argue that essay, in that essay, the author of that essay, the AI, did not have that. And as a result, there was some kind of ambiguity that was not optimal. But anyway, it's an interesting question. Can do AIs have cognitive empathy?
Not by default, but you can add that into the prompt, right? Whatever the prompt was, I could add to it, write it in a way that would appeal to a rural American in the 21st century. And I don't know if it would do a great job, but it's within the range of possibilities. You can find that out.
Right.
And they would get better with time.
Yeah. No, that probably will be. And so anyway, I don't know what else. I am gonna, I'm sufficiently worried about this whole project that I am going to be asking you for other ideas. And I don't know if there are any other thoughts you have now. Go ahead.
Honestly, just the last couple of days, I've been in a mood where I don't feel like I have ideas. I feel like I just have bad feelings about the world and this whole human incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to need to assemble myself and channel this into a creative way. So right now on the spot, I don't think I have something to contribute.
Well, as I said, wisdom is coming to you earlier than it came to me. So anyway, so thanks. We'll be back, I don't know, a month or so down the road. Meanwhile, there's your newsletter, Psychopolitica.
Psychopolitica, yeah, it's Substack, spelled with a C. There is a paid
not
version.
A K, which was always my recommendation.
Yeah. It was a consideration. There is a paid version, and all the money from the paid version goes to buy humanitarian aid for Ukraine. So that's something we could do. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't think I've said explicitly that you're both a writer. You write things in the newsletter, but also you're an artist and you do creative things visually. And you're fooling around with that part of AI as well. And
I have collaborations with other artists.
Right.
There's a lot of stuff happening.
You just had one of them on a podcast, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, keep it up. And congratulations on marriage and getting out of Russia.
Thank you.
And we'll see you down the road.